we've recruited a stellar cast of speakers who will each share their opening thoughts about the industry. There'll be a then group discussion on their presentation, and then we move on to the next presentation. So, let me introduce our stellar cast. Sara, Dhariwal, aviation analyst and lead appraiser at Cirium. Then we have Gérard Deterne, CEO and founder, Pteron Valuations. Next up is Steve Robertson, MD, LCI Analytics. Next to him, we have Roberto Garavaglia, forgive my accent, who is Senior Vice President, Strategy and Innovation, Leonardo Helicopters. And on the end, David Prevor, who leads the manufacturing department in the Airbus Helicopters Global Business Directorate. Now, we're going to start off with the manufacturers in this session. So I'm going to invite each speaker, starting with David and then with Roberto, to share their thoughts about the industry. So, David Prevor, Airbus, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Good morning, everybody. So, it's already the second slide. So, I just actually to give you a flavor about what is the outlook over the next 10 years, at least, our latest outlook in terms of civil and public deliveries. So today we have an installed fleet that exceeds 27,000 aircraft in service all over the world, including all turbine helicopters. What do we anticipate is basically actually there was a small growth in terms of fleet in service, only 1.1%. It used to be a little bit higher in the past, but when we look actually at the future potential, we are pretty conservative when we look at the future. Still, we anticipate a growth 1.1%. This growth will translate in a fleet in service in 10 years from now exceeding 30,000 units. And when we look at the split, or what we will trigger as deliveries, we have all in all more than 7,600 aircraft to be delivered over the next 10 years, including actually 40% for growth, so more than 3,000 helicopters will be delivered for growth, and almost 4,500 helicopters for replacement. This ratio, I would say, it's a little bit different from the past. As I said before, we anticipate a lower growth. Over the last decade, actually, it was a little bit the opposite. It was 60% of deliveries were for growth, whereas actually 40% were only for replacement. Most of the replacement will come from the mature economies, North America, Europe, and the growth will be driven by emerging regions. We have some specificities in some developing regions. For example, Brazil, today we cannot say that actually there is a huge potential for growth in the private and business aviation segment because they are pretty well equipped. On the contrary, there is huge potential in EMS, public services, and commercial transportation. So, to be simplistic, growth from emerging regions and replacement for mature market. At this stage, over the last decade, since actually I'm working on this subject, we always talk about emergence of China and India. So yes, there is a growth there in India and China. We've seen it over the last decade as well, but the potential is much higher. One of the constraints is regulation, so I think actually everybody almost knows that. So we do not include actually the regulation of the Chinese and Indian market in this forecast. Should we do so, actually it will add something like 700 units over the next 10 years, split half between single-engine helicopters and twin-engine helicopters. So this is about the evolution and the demand. So as I've said before, actually, most of the demand will be for replacement. And here it's a chart for statisticians, but actually it illustrates quite well actually the distribution and how actually replacement works. So on one hand, we have the EMS and energy market, where we see that actually the average age and the median age is pretty low. In this type of markets, actually, operators tend to replace aircraft rather soon, between 15 to 20 years, sometimes even sooner. And these operators are buying or leasing new assets. On the private and business aviation, I would say we have two types of markets. One part of the market is the ones actually that are buying new helicopters, but we have also a significant part of the market in the private and business aviation, where people actually take second-hand helicopters as well. So I would say this market is triggering deliveries of both new and second-hand helicopters. On public services, typically the operators tend to rather buy new helicopters, but once they've bought it, actually, they tend to keep it for a long period of time. They are not replacing the helicopters so quickly. And on the commercial, I would say we have a limited contribution to new deliveries, much lower, for example, than EMS and energy. Still, some people are buying new helicopters, but basically this commercial market is served mostly by second-hand helicopters. So all in all, when we look actually at the picture of deliveries splitted by category, the main message here is that 50% of the units will be for single-engine helicopters, and 50% of the units will be for twin-engine helicopters, light twin, intermediate, up to the heavies. In value, actually, the picture is pretty different, I would say. It's 80% of the value in terms of deliveries will be for twin-engine helicopters, just because of the price, basically. One point, perhaps, actually, to add as well to this picture is that we still identify a significant demand for heavy helicopters. Having said that, out of the 500 units that we anticipate, 360 actually are for only Russia, so it's a very specific market. And then we see that most of the deliveries in the heavy category will be for public services. A little bit for energy, because we still see a potential demand for, it's a small demand, but there is still a demand for long-range operations and also operations in demanding conditions with de-icing, for example. So long-range operation with de-icing, actually, sometimes actually you will still need actually a heavy helicopter. Having said that, when we look at the contribution by category or by, I would say, mission, we see that in the light twin category, EMS is a key contributor to the new deliveries. It's still the case a little bit on the intermediate twins, but we see actually a higher contribution on public services. Mediums, we start to see actually a huge contribution from public services, but also from energy. And on super medium, we have a huge contribution from energy. Having said that, just one comment on public services. What we see as well is that even if we identify helicopters as being public services, we have many customers that actually are buying helicopters for public services as a first use, but then they are converted when it's needed actually for EMS operations. It's the case, for example, of the Czech police that operate 135s, and when they need to do EMS operations, they just quickly change the 135 to EMS operations. So that's basically all. So over the next years, we see that actually we still identify a demand for, or significant demand for helicopters, and we are talking about something like 800 deliveries per year on an average basis. Basically, it was the number of bookings that we have identified for in 2024. So I would say there is no breakthrough in terms of what we anticipate over the next 10 years. And that's all.
David Prevor from Airbus Helicopters, thank you very much. Can we mention the B word, backlogs? Can you give us an update on the backlog situation?
So backlogs, actually, it's so we don't share like actually figures on the backlogs. Having said that, today we need to ramp up. We are ramping up actually almost on all the programs. The main challenge today is the 145, because the 145 is doing a little bit too well, I would say, in a way. So it's a good issue or problem to address. We face huge surge in terms of order intake on the military side as well, and that's why actually we need to ramp up, and we are working on it. We have also some issues, I would say, because we have too many orders on the 175. Therefore, actually today, I would say we have a lead time that is well too long, and we are working on it. So
okay.
We are ramping up. The ambition is actually to reduce the lead time to 18 months. On the 160, we start to have the same issue as well, so we are ramping up. Our ambition is actually to achieve 40 deliveries per year, and even actually to go to 60, because we have also the military version that will actually enter into service. So once actually we'll have the military version, we need to achieve 60 helicopters per year.
Okay, thank you for that. Roberto, what can you tell us about the backlog at Leonardo?
Let's see. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think that's on. Yeah.
We have a good backlog in about I would say I cannot be specific on the number of helicopters, but the backlog is almost 3 years worth of production, or revenues for the helicopter division overall. So including military, civil, etc. I cannot be more specific than that, but let's say that this is something which keeps us pretty happy at this point in time. So it's a healthy backlog, and in an industrial company like ours, having 3 years worth equivalent of revenues in almost 3 years in backlog is something good to have in a good situation.
Okay. So obviously backlogs are keeping manufacturers happy. They're also keeping pre-owned aircraft sales companies happy. Any observations on that, Gérard?
On the pre-owned?
Yeah. Well, the impact of backlogs specifically, I was thinking. The impact of backlogs on on pre-owned.
On the pre-owned?
Yeah.
Well, was not prepared for that.
You got it. Yeah.
For sure, those products that have a long lead time with a significant backlog, and I'm thinking about the H145, for example, where customers need to wait for a long time. So of course they will turn to the pre-owned market while waiting for new deliveries. So that's going to impact. Maybe something similar, maybe on the 139 on a certain case. So the pre-owned market will be influenced by the OEM backlog on new products, and especially the product in high demand.
Yeah.
And this is the challenge is to find the equivalent aircraft on the used market while waiting for a brand new H145 or 139, for example.
Yeah. If I may, actually, it's on the 145 more specifically. What we have as cases, we have customers that need quickly 145. We cannot deliver because actually the lead time is too long. Then they ask us actually to chase second-hand 145, and actually we are struggling to find the 145. Yeah. And when we find it, actually the value may be a little bit too high.
Okay. Sara Dhariwal, replacements, presumably the bulk of the replacements are on multi-engine offshore in the fleet. Is that right?
I've got a presentation.
Yeah. Well, we'll come to that. Do you want to save it for that? Fine. Okay. If you want to save, keep your powder dry.
There's still a lot of singles, light
Yeah.
singles that need replacing as well. So
Yeah.
I think, I'll leave you hanging on that.
Okay. Right. Keep our appetite whetted. Steve, any observations on the first presentation?
Yeah, I think in terms of fleet replacement and backlogs, from an offshore perspective, the market is quite predictable.
Yeah.
If it takes you 3 years to build an oil platform or 5 years to build an oil platform, you've got the ability to actually see that demand in advance and then secure the capacity. And I think with the lack of speculative orders in the market in the last 10 years, we've actually seen behaviours change a little bit, and we've seen the upstream energy companies actually getting involved in the process of ordering aircraft and taking slots. Shell have done that, Equinor have done that, Vara Energy as we have.
I want to come on to that because I think it's a very interesting development in the market, and we'll explore that just after your presentation. Let's move on now to Roberto from Leonardo for his presentation.
Well, I do not have a presentation, which would have been, I have some numbers with me, but they are not in a sort of a presentation grade today, but I was happy to see what David has shown, and I can tell you that apart from a few differences in terminology, the curves are of similar shape than the curves that we predict. So probably because we use the same sources, and we look at the same things, and we have been looking at the same things for a long time. So I would generally agree with those numbers. We tend to look at the growth of the fleet, of course, is important, and the share between replacement and new helicopters, so fleet growth is important, and we agree that there are probably a little more replacement than fleet growth, but just marginally above that. We agree the single engine market being the busiest in terms of units, clearly not the busiest in terms of revenues generated by that, and I agree that more or less the shape of the light intermediate, or how we call it, intermediate medium. We have slightly different terminologies, are mostly the same. So that my message is there is a consistent view, I think, between the two of us. I'm discovering it today about the future of the market. The observation is we have to take into account a new phenomenon for which both OEMs are benefiting and we are benefiting as Leonardo, which is the progressive growth of dual use for military usage. So which for us is very important because it allows a stabilization of production lines. We need, of course, to manage production to address let's say markets which have more or less urgency to procure new equipment based on the specific dynamics.
Does that mean military?
Yes.
Yeah.
But the military are typically more patient, so they are, although they are starting from an existing civilian or certificated or commercial derivative platforms, they will wait for more because of their procurement cycles and because they want to have some mission equipment embedded, which is not immediately available. But the good thing is that overall there is a saving because you are not designing a specialized platform, as you still do, by the way, if you procure a very heavy lift, CH-47, or an attack helicopter like the 249, or an anti-submarine helicopter like the NH-90, where, of course, you need to have specialized platforms for mission, overall mission effectiveness and fitness for purpose. But for a lot of utility roles, I mean, the 139, which has been named many times, and for which we have two active production line, one in Vergiate in Italy, and the other one in Philadelphia, helps us also to serve the market. You probably know that the 139 is now entering service with the US Air Force and a program primed by Boeing, which is the MH-139, and to serve the Strike Command. So it is the same 139, basically, apart from a few adjustments, that is being produced for the offshore or the executive market. But this gives us more volume, the possibility to work on very different configurations, and the 139 is magic because it does everything everywhere in the world, and it can be adapted to a multitude of roles. The cabin, the overall sizing, I would say, if I can make a comparison, is the 139 is the A320 or the 737 of the helicopter market. Is the with all due respect, I quote the A320. I mean, it's at the heart of the helicopter market. As you move higher, and 189, which is derived from the 139, I mean, was originally in the same family concept as the 139. It's about 20% bigger. Its size already specializes it a little more into the offshore search and rescue and the super VIP market, but you will not find 189s for pure EMS operations, whereas you find a lot of 139s which are doing EMS operation. The opposite is in the 169, which is the smaller brother of the three, although actually is the youngest, where the application and for utilization for EMS and parapublic roles prevails over offshore and other roles. So there is an interesting distribution of roles for the three helicopters of the family, but the family is our backbone of offering in the transport category for the civil market.
Yeah. Okay. So can I ask, aside from multi-use, military civil, to what extent is the military's thirst for lift denying the civil market helicopters, and what impact, in a generic sense?
Denying?
Well, the number of helicopters going into military use, what impact?
I wouldn't say, I mean, as I said, the military orders can be managed more easily
Yeah.
than those for civil. So, of course, we can ramp up production. There is not the same level of urgency for military, so you can manage them. And I was telling you about the backlog, the 3-year equivalent 3 years of backlog, which extends beyond 3 years for some product ranges. No, we ramp up production.
Okay.
We ramp up production, and we manage, of course, the supply chain and all of that.
Yeah. David Prevor, Airbus, any observations about the relative demand between military and civil use helicopters?
So I would say that, military customers may be more patient. Having said that, sometimes, and mostly actually, the configuration are a little bit more complex, and when it comes actually to ramp up, it may create some difficulty because the lead time to manufacture a helicopter that is for military use sometimes may be a little bit longer. So it may slow down a little bit the production of the civil helicopters, but I would say it's marginal. Having said that, when you develop something that is of interest for military, it's always good actually to think about a civil application. And today we see that in public services, actually there are some applications that we've developed for the military guys that may be useful as well for public services, law enforcement. Sometimes even you have public services helicopters that are equipped with actually armaments, small armaments. And so actually we see it as a synergy, and also we can capitalize on the volume effect to amortize our cost and to be more competitive even on the civil market. So I would say that both markets are taking benefits because of the volumes. So
Okay. So, Roberto, you mentioned in connection with the 139, everything, everywhere in the world. Steve, is the future super medium shaped?
Well, the super medium. Sorry. This is, I heard of Roberto. I know it was too.
I can see that's a trigger word for you, Roberto. We'll come back to you. You can have a say, but let's Steve have a go first.
AI 1.0. I'm a little. Go ahead.
Look, I think the super mediums clearly fit into a number of niche roles very well. I think Roberto's mentioned it already. You have offshore. Search and rescue, in some cases VIP, VVIP, and really actually the military sector and some of these non-energy sector markets have kind of carried these super medium programs over the last 10 years.
Yeah.
When we look at the oil and gas market, we see a delivery cadence of about 5 units a year, each of the 175 and the 189 over the last 10 years. So really the demand from some of these parallel sectors or military sectors has really been very supportive for these programs.
Okay. Gérard, any observations on super mediums?
Definitely. I can just agree with what Steve said. Actually, we worked on that together. This is really the helicopter type that fits the energy sector, especially in the light of the ramping down of the S-92. As far as the energy sector is concerned. So this is definitely the product, both 175 and 189 actually in an equal manner, very well positioned to address those markets, even if not in high quantities. We have today about 45, 50 helicopters each in the energy sector. This is going to ramp up. Never in huge numbers, but definitely the type where you need to go.
All right, thank you for that. Roberto, I'm now going to say your trigger word, super medium, so please tell us what you were going to share earlier.
Yeah, well, no, my point on super mediums was that they are they're going to become a dominant player in the offshore market as they are already. After a slow start, because they were introduced, we introduced the 189. I remember we did the launch at the Paris Air Show in 2011, and by the time it was ready, there was the big oil price slump of the mid-10s. So let's say, we have to be a little more patient to see the market, the demand for that type to ramp up. However, I was, if I can make, I have a fixed wing background, so if I can make another comparison with fixed wing, the super mediums compare against the older, heavier, the 19-seaters as the 350 and the 777 compared to the 747 and the 380. So they are the future. The super mediums have, I would say, 85–90% of the performance capability that you need in the offshore market. Probably there is a tiny part for extreme operations which can still covered by the bigger helicopters because of their unique extreme range capabilities, which will not be replaced for a long time. But for most of the heavier utilization, so a longer range utilization above the mediums, so the 139 category, they're perfectly fine. They come at a lower acquisition cost, lower operating cost. So I think the trend is set to also, because using a smaller asset to do the same job than the bigger asset is much more flexible and economically viable, we believe.
Okay.
We'll have to see how the S-92s will tail off over time. Now I think the market has accepted that this fine type is going to, has seen already its heydays in terms of quantity in the fleet. I could anticipate a parallel of the S-61, which has been a great helicopter, but possibly
Let's park that there, because I want to come back to the place of super mediums relative to heavies in the overall fleet mix.
Yeah.
And let's come back to that in a while. So we've heard from two of our leading manufacturers. We've heard from Airbus, we've heard from Leonardo. If you have questions for them or anyone else on the team, please use Slido, or please put your hand up during our next discussion session, and we'll try and take those on board. So from manufacturers, we're now going to replacement with Sara Dhariwal from Cirium.
Thank you, Mike. David, I got a little bit worried you'd actually stolen my presentation there for a while, so I've been sitting here thinking how I can do things a little bit differently, but I think I can manage that. The good thing is that we're pretty much on the same page, otherwise it might have gotten a bit embarrassing.
That's lucky.
So, I was asked to speak on replacement demand and deliveries, which is my favorite subject because that allows me to speak about the longevity of the asset, which is absolutely key to underpin the strong residual values that we have for the helicopter asset in particular. I'm not going to go in too much on the actual numbers on this slide because you can obviously see it yourselves, but talking about replacement and retirement that underpins our predictions for the future. And it's really quite interesting to see that retirement rates for the last 10 years has kept at about 1% of the fleet, which is not that many aircraft. Adding to retirement, you got the total loss through accidents, which in this space of the commercial helicopter sector is a little bit higher because of the missions and the terrains that these aircraft will have to operate in. But I'm really pleased that 20 years ago we had a 1% total loss rate. In the last 5 years, despite adding aircraft to the fleet, that's reduced to 0.5%, which is a great story, I think. But overall, we do have an aging fleet, and I go back to the manufacturer's backlog in that discussion. I think the fact that you can't get a new aircraft in 6 months helps the used aircraft market and the existing fleet to keep up their values and then underpin that residual forecast that we have. So it might be frustrating, but in a way it actually works towards that longevity of the fleet that we see today. So the forecast in terms of deliveries is, we're a bit more conservative. We say 48 billion in the next 10 years. That's in 2024 dollars, based on the full life aircraft in sort of an unconfigured aircraft. So in the next forecast period, adding replacements, which is 4,100, and growth, another 3,600, we predict 7,700 aircraft, which is pretty spot on Airbus, actually, to 7650. So that was quite lucky there, I think. So that's pretty equally split between replacement and growth, as I said. And going back to what... Obviously, when you predict year on year, so it's quite unlikely to look as even in terms of delivery numbers for the next 10 years, because we have seen some volatility in deliveries in the last 10. But if you look at the actual growth of the total helicopter fleet, it's been growing at a very steady 1.5% year on year for the last 10 years, and we expect that to be comparable in the next 10. And talking about what we add to the fleet, what's replacement to the fleet, the largest fleet that we have is in the light singles. And they operate in things like corporate, air taxi, and we expect them to take approximately 20, the majority, so say about 40% of the total deliveries in the next 10 years, but by value, that's about 20% of that 48 billion cake, if you like. Comparably, the offshore and the SAR usage, we expect that to take about a 10% share of the deliveries in the next 10 years. But in value, that's almost 50% of that 48 billion slice cake. So it's quite interesting to see. I think it's quite important when we talk about helicopters, we like to talk about what's going on in the super medium plus area, because that's what, or medium plus area, because that's what we largely invest in because of the high value of that asset. But when you look at this, you got to remember that it goes down to the twin turbine fleet, civil helicopter fleet, goes down to the light singles, and that's things like the R66, Bell 505, and there's quite a high volume of aircraft in that sector. That's why it makes it a little bit difficult to forecast sometimes and make it fully super relevant to this room. I don't know what I have on the next slide, so I'm just going to click through and see what happens.
It's exciting, isn't it?
I know,
Is that all right?
A little bit.
Yeah.
So this is delivery by usage. I've covered that a little bit anyway. Deliveries by region. We also agreed that North America and Europe is going to be a driver in terms of replacement. 60%, I think that's pretty much what you said, David. And then we predict APAC to come in on another sort of round about 30% of that. So 90% between those. We got some growth in Latin America, like we've talked about yesterday. We mentioned Brazil as a growth area. But going back to usages and what we said, those light singles, they almost account for 50% of the total fleet. So a lot of deliveries and replacements will be going into that. Then I've got a new slide, another slide, and I know what's on that because I've done my favorite thing and placed some helicopter pictures on there. So moving into the next 10 years, we have replacements. What are our replacement key types? What are the current key types that are going to keep in the fleet? And then we have the new types. We've got the AW09 coming in. We've got the R88. We've got the H140 and the Bell 525. And I guess the question is there room for them? Are they going to fit in?
Is there room for them, and will they fit in?
I think they will.
Oh, great. Phew.
I think the dynamic, and I was going to say that earlier, on the super medium plus side, I agree the super medium is a strong asset. I do still think there is life in the S92. I think we're going to see that for a long time still. I think we might see the fleet reduce naturally through retirements to become a bit more maybe right-sized. We quite rightly see the new technology in the super mediums coming in, and I think that's natural. Adding the 525, and I also know that Airbus is keen to see the 225 back on that scene. That means that the competition in that heavy sector is going to be more fierce than it ever has been, with demand being significantly reduced for that size aircraft. So I think that space is going to be extremely competitive.
Right. Thank you very much for that quick canter through the topics. Do you think that given the rate of replacement and the OEM's backlog, that primary mission life will get longer?
It's an interesting question. I think when we did the analysis, we did expect to see some sort of reduction in the useful economic life, but we haven't seen any signs of that yet. So in terms of how long they stay in their primary missions, I think we think that's going to remain largely as it has been in the last 10, 20 years.
Does anyone apart from Steve have a view about the extension of primary mission lives? Obviously, we're coming to you next, Steve. But does anyone else have any comments about longer primary mission lives?
My only observation is that as OEMs and the introduction of new types towards the end of the last century and the beginning of this one has allowed the replacement of helicopters which had older certification standards when it comes to certain safety requirements, such as crashworthiness, etc. All new types are there, and from that point of view, apart from the, I would say, always welcome improvement in safety, I don't see a major quantum leap in requirements, unless something happens on sustainability, engine, etc. But I don't see technology to be there now to serve on large helicopters these requirements for the future. So just an elaboration to say, I believe the extension of primary surface life is a fairly realistic one.
Okay. David Prevor, Airbus.
I would share the view. The only comment I would make is that we may have a little bit of discrepancy between, I would say, EMS and energy, where actually we see some kind of stability in terms of life expectancy, increasing a little bit, but not much.
Okay.
And the only segment where actually I see kind of a longer period of time, it's commercial. Because sometimes, actually, they just keep the asset or they buy second-hand asset. So actually, in a way, they extend the primary mission. And public services, but it's more linked to the history of, equipments, rate of equipments increasing. So all in all, I would say that it's increasing a little bit, but not significantly, at least in EMS and energy.
David, thank you for that. Steve Robertson, your presentation now, please.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning, everybody. Very much appreciate the opportunity to share some views this morning. I think we heard yesterday a number of interesting themes around the rotary market in general, and also the offshore market in particular. I think one of those observations was that we got the assumptions wrong 10 years ago. And I think walking through some of those assumptions might be quite an interesting thing to do here. I think just to start off, looking at the S92, which remains the workhorse of the sharp end of the oil and gas industry, over 90% of the helicopters delivered into the offshore crew change market is still working as of today. Very, very few of those are past 20,000 hours, let alone getting close to the 30,000 hour limits. This chart on the screen here tells quite a few stories, including some of the ones we saw yesterday on the left-hand side. Back in only 3 years ago in 2022, we had sheds or hangars full of aircraft that had been returned either by banks or by operators that had gone into Chapter 11. Sorry, not returned by banks, returned by operators that have gone into Chapter 11, either to banks or to lessors, sitting uncontracted. In a very, very short period of time, we've seen demand recover and the industry scramble to put aircraft back into service. What this has created, of course, is a huge demand on MRO services. We've seen actually, despite the number of aircraft that have gone back on the line in the last 2 to 3 years, a lot have come off the line as well. And that sort of chasing the tail activity has only recently in Q4 actually turned to the extent that we're seeing the number of active aircraft actually increasing rather than decreasing in the S92 market. So effectively, in the heavy and super medium markets at the moment, we see that they're sold out really in terms of capacity. There's very few aircraft that are not contracted. There's 2 in the S92 market, and neither of those we think are actually flyable in the near term. And of the near 50 189s and 175s, almost all of those are contracted as of today. So this has had a very positive impact on the financials in this sector, the standing charges that operators are able to achieve and the lease rates that lessors are able to achieve. Again, I heard this phrase, sort of boring stability yesterday, and I would perhaps flip that around to manic activity. I think this recovery we've seen, particularly in the energy sector, has been very, very disjointed. In fact, what we have is very, very strong recovery in some countries, and we have terminal decline actually in other countries, and that's the pathway for that over the period to 2030 is pretty much defined. If we look at countries such as the UK or the Netherlands, we're seeing already that vessels are being contracted to take these platforms out of the water 2 or 3 years in advance. There's platform removals booked for 2027, 2028. So we think in the UK sector over the period to 2030 we'll need 16 fewer aircraft in the UK market alone. The flip side of that, of course, is that we're seeing strong demand in Brazil, resurgence of activity, excuse me, in Africa, and recovery and activity in Australia. And you can see that in some of the patterns of the way that aircraft have moved around over the last year. And of course, with the demand on the MRO services, of course, we're seeing a lot of aircraft being cycled to places where that MRO capacity exists, such as Canada. We've heard from the OEMs that they sadly don't share their order books with us. We would love to see them, because I would say this is probably one of the most important factors or assumptions that needs to be taken into account going forward. We heard from Michael York yesterday that just an overcapacity of 5 helicopters can be enough to turn the market the wrong direction. And the reality today is that we've seen significant ordering over the last 18 months, which we think is needed. We've effectively had a decade of lost helicopter ordering. But these helicopters will mostly replace existing older units or units that age out. But the order book as it's structured today, we think, is that there's a very large number of options in the order book, which essentially means as of today you've got a fairly substantial uncertainty about just how many aircraft are going to be delivered. So certainly we think there's a need for caution in this market in terms of new orders. I think what I heard there from David and Roberto is that actually the OEMs are running pretty hard. They're running almost flat out. The lead times for super medium aircraft are at least 24 months from what I understand. And for heavy aircraft, you're probably looking more like 4 years, whether that's Airbus or Sikorsky. So I think on the forward assumptions, there's a great deal of uncertainty in the extent to which these get delivered into the oil and gas market. Some of them might be configured in a different way, but the extent to which these get delivered is going to very much define whether we have an oversupply or a correct supply of aircraft going forward. The other thing, I think, is that, first of all, replacement, if you replace a heavy with a super medium, it's not a one-for-one. You're going to need effectively 1.2 super mediums for every heavy you replace. And then you've got to think about what the availability of these aircraft is going to look like. We've spent a bit of time looking at the availability of aircraft, the time that aircraft spend in base maintenance. And actually, whereas before you might have planned for an aircraft to be off the line maybe for a month, 20 days to a month every year, that was certainly the case pre-COVID. Today, you wouldn't be planning that at all. You'd be planning that your aircraft would be off the line for 2 months of the year. So that assumption has doubled just in the space of 5 years. And if that's the new normal, then we need to factor that into how we think about the future. So I think, look, from the macro perspective, clearly there's a lot of uncertainty in the market. We've got inherently transitory shifts in geopolitics, but the uncertainty that creates can delay investment decisions. I think there's definitely a caution in the market about the strength of oil demand. I would say from the supply perspective, we're not in a 2014 scenario. The US increased production from 5 million barrels a day to 12 million barrels a day in a very, very short period of time over the second half of the last decade. And despite the drill, baby drill rhetoric, we don't see that there's actually the prospectivity, the opportunities to drill offshore in the US that will turn around the decline we see in the US. So I don't think we're going to see another 2014. I think we're going to see a slow and steady transition where effectively oil demand stays the same or around the same, and new sources are supplementary rather than replacing oil demand. And I think the oil and gas market might be stable, but that's the sum of the parts, and we're seeing a lot of flux. On the ESG side, I think ESG is still a significant factor in this market. We heard this yesterday. It was articulated very well by Airbus, Reeve, and SAF yesterday. But this is a very hard to abate sector. So I think, look, the reality is we're going to be relying on carbon credits, direct air capture, like we heard yesterday, and SAF. So I'll leave it there. But
right, thank you very much, Steve Robertson, LCI Analytics. We could spend the rest of the morning debating the points we've heard so far. Goodbye to 2014. That will be welcome news to a lot of people. Thank you for that view. I'm going to ask now Gérard Deterne from Pteron Valuations to take us to the world of EMS.
Yes. This is a smaller market, but I think let's get into a bit more details on that one. These are Pteron figures. I count about 2,830, 50 helicopters doing EMS throughout the world, and that's only Western-made helicopters. I decided to exclude Russian-made helicopters or helicopters that sit in hangars and aren't really used. Sometimes you hear about 3,000, 3,100, but I think I prefer to stay with the real active helicopters, even though some of them sometimes are stored as spares in hangars. I have a specific point on the so-called onshore rescue helicopters, 350. These are helicopters doing, of course, primary and secondary missions, but as well as engage into disaster relief situations. So helicopters capable of doing hoisting, capable of doing firefighting, actually, very often operated by government agencies such as the Japan Coast Guard, the Korea Fire Department, or Los Angeles Fire Department, this sort of things. They all do primary and secondary missions, but sometimes capable of doing more, and 350 of those. Of course, the EMS fleet is mostly Airbus, taking the lion's shares with different products, 60% of the EMS fleet worldwide, followed by Bell helicopters, mostly flying in the US, as we will see later. The EMS fleet is rather young, in fact. 80% is below 20 years old, meaning that you have about 580, 600 helicopters more than 20 years old, potentially candidate for replacement over the years to come. Geographically, 80% of the fleet is operated in North America and Europe. So when you're asking how is the EMS market doing, when in fact you're asking how is Europe and North America doing as far as EMS is concerned. In fact, North America representing actually half of the HEMS fleet. Can you imagine? So we had 1,500 helicopters flying in the US alone. And actually focusing on just countries, just 11 countries in the world represent 80% of the EMS market. And we can name them. I mean, this is the US, of course, as previously said.
Is the No Surprises Act having an impact still in North America? We saw what happened to Air Methods. The No Surprises Act.
This is something which has existed for, ever since we've been observing the EMS market. I mean, the US fleet is just half of the world fleet. I mean, this has been the case for a long time.
Okay.
And then followed by Germany, France, Italy, Austria, Spain, the UK. And in Asia, Japan and Australia. I mean, these 11 countries represent 80% of the whole fleet. Of course, you have other dynamic countries, but already well equipped. I mean, we've seen Saudi Arabia ordering quite a lot, but that is a specific case. And in Europe, countries like Switzerland, Poland, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Portugal, I could name a few others, already well equipped. And actually, sometimes, very often, we could even talk about a market saturation situation. In Asia, on top of Japan and Australia, Korea and New Zealand are already well equipped. I mean, the HEMS fleet is a very diverse fleet with a lot of models, variants. Actually, I counted like more than 30 different models and variants. 70% are twin engine and 30% are single engine, mostly flying in the US. 13 of those products are still promoted by their respective OEMs, meaning that you have another large group of models that are no longer produced nor promoted. The leading models, 10 models represent 80% of the whole fleet. I mean, definitely the HEMS market is an 80% market. With the EC135, H135 family having the leading role. I mean, they have about more than 720 EC135, H135 flying worldwide, followed by the EC145, H145 family. Coming also right after the Bell 407, Bell 206, but of course mostly flying in the US. I mean, the US is really a specific market in that sense, in terms of platforms flying there. The 139, the AW139 has been gaining momentum, as we will see later. But of course, the AW109, Lightwing, SP and Trekker are doing quite well. And on the single side, on the Airbus side, the EC130, H130, but also some Écureuil, AS350, B2, B3, and the H125. We should not forget 4 other challenges that are addressing more specific requirements. The Bell 412 and the Bell 429 can address specific requirements, as well as the AW119 and 169, which can do specific requirements. But when we look at the HEMS fleet from a weight and size point of view, you realize that this is the 3 tons helicopters that are the most in great numbers. As you can see, like 40% of the fleet is less than 3 tons. I mean, between 2.6 and 3 tons. And this is where you have the Bell 47 and of course, the EC135 and H135 family. Another group which has been gaining momentum is the 3.4, 3.8 tons with the EC145 family, with, as we will see later, quite a number of those entering the market every year. But this is where you have, like in between around 3 ton, 3.4, the old BK117 that are a candidate for replacement, and you have the old Bell 222, 230 that are in there. That are candidate for replacement. On the extreme side of the weight category, around 6 tons, 7 tons. This is, of course, the AW139, which addresses, specific operational requirements. Of course, long-range missions, cabin capacity, and in that sense, we've seen a lot of those being deployed in Australia, in Canada, and well, in Italy, of course, as well. Doing hoisting operations. These are the ones that are do onshore rescue operations. In the middle, the 169, around 5 tons, 4.8, 5 tons, is trying to gain some market shares, but it is sort of a niche thing at the moment.
I should say I'm beginning to draw menacing looks from the control desk, so if we can move to a summary, that would be great.
Just looking at the 2024 market activity, and that tells us a lot about what's going on, what's going to happen over the next few years. This is a 2.5 growth every year, roughly speaking, 2.1, 2.5 growth on the HEMS fleet. With the new entrants, definitely 145, a tremendous entry into the market, and the 139. In terms of the 3 tons, I think we could talk about a smart move on the part of Airbus with the introduction of the H140, which we believe, with larger cabin requirements becoming more and more common in developed countries, we can imagine that the 140 is going to take a good market share, addressing the current requirements, and the H145 continuing to replace the old ones. This is what can be said.
Thank you so much for summarising that briefly. We could spend all morning talking about, I'm so sorry that we have no time to explore in greater detail all these points. I've been fascinated by that and I've learnt a lot. I think all that remains is for me to thank our speakers, David Prevor from Airbus Helicopters, Roberto from Leonardo Helicopters, Sara Dhariwal, Cirium, Steve Robertson from LCI Analytics, and Gérard Deterne from Pteron Valuations. Thank you so much.